Here's 2 hours of One Piece facts to fall asleep to. Somewhere, buried in a stack of notebooks Ichiro Oda has been filling since before most fans were born, there's a version of this story that ends completely differently. That's not a rumor. Oda has said outright that the ending of One Piece was decided early, locked in his head for decades, and that everything since has just been him walking toward it. Which sounds simple. It isn't. Because here's the thing about One Piece that separates it from almost every other long-running series. It looks like a pirate adventure. Loud, colorful, a little goofy. At first glance, it's a story about a boy who wants to be king of the pirates. That seems normal enough. Except the closer you look, the more you realize the entire world was built backwards. Oda didn't invent islands and then figure out what mysteries to hide there. He hid the mysteries first, then built islands around them. Take the title itself, One Piece. For years, casual viewers assumed it just meant the treasure, a single prize sitting at the end of the Grand Line. Which, sure, that's technically true, but there's a reason Oda never called it the treasure or the final prize. Word choice matters to him in a way most action manga creators never bother with. One Piece implies something singular, something whole. Not a pile of gold, not a mountain of jewels. One Piece, singular. That word choice becomes a lot more interesting once you learn what's actually waiting at Laugh Tale. But before we get there, we have to talk about the man who put it there, Gol D. Roger. Here's what most casual fans know. Roger was the pirate king. He found the One Piece, and his execution kicked off the entire golden age of piracy. Simple enough, except almost nobody stops to ask the obvious question. Why would a man about to be publicly executed in front of thousands of witnesses casually announce the location and existence of the greatest treasure in the world? That's not bravado. That's not a dying man's joke. Roger doesn't do anything by accident in this story, and neither does Oda. It gets even stranger when you realize Roger had already been to Laugh Tale. He'd already seen whatever's there. He knew the truth of the Void Century. He knew what the world government was hiding. And instead of using that knowledge to burn the government to the ground himself, he let himself get caught. He let himself die. Publicly, loudly, in the one place guaranteed to be witnessed by the entire world. That's not the death of a man who lost. That's the final move of a man who won, and decided the best way to finish the game was to hand the board to everyone else. Which brings us to the phrase that's haunted fan theories since day one, the Will of D. Nobody in the story has ever fully explained what the D stands for. Not officially. Not once across over 1,000 chapters. Characters react to it with fear or reverence or dread, but never with an explanation. Roger has it. Luffy has it. Blackbeard has it. Even some of Luffy's enemies have it. And there's a pattern almost every longtime reader eventually notices. Characters who carry the D tend to be the ones who shake the world's foundations, whether they're heroes or monsters. Here's the part that hardly anyone catches on a first read. The world government doesn't fear pirates. Not really. They fear a name. There's a scene where members of the Five Elders react to Luffy's full name with something closer to dread than annoyance. The same reaction Roger's crew triggered decades earlier. That's not a coincidence in a story this carefully mapped out. Oda has said in interviews that the meaning of the D was decided from the very beginning, which means every single time a D character showed up, it wasn't filler. It was a puzzle piece being placed on purpose. At first glance, the Void Century seems like simple world building. 100 years of history the world government erased from every record. Except think about what that actually requires. Erasing a century of history isn't something you do with propaganda. You need cooperation from every major kingdom. You need to destroy every book. You need generations of enforcement to make sure nobody digs it back up. That's not the work of a paranoid government. That's the work of a government terrified of something specific being remembered. And then there's the poneglyphs. Stones nobody in the current era can casually read. Stones that predate the world government itself. Here's where things get interesting. The ability to read them isn't taught in any school we've seen. It's an ancient, dying skill, deliberately kept rare. Why would the people who erased history also make sure a handful of scholars could still read the one thing that survived the erasing? That's not an oversight. That's a loophole left on purpose. And loopholes like that don't exist by accident in a story where the author plans his ending before he plans his villains. Nico Robin is the living proof of how seriously the government treats this. An entire island, O'Hara, wiped from the map, its scholars executed, all because they were getting close to the truth. Robin survived as a child by literally being underestimated, dismissed as harmless. That single event doesn't just explain her powers or her backstory. It explains why the government's fear of history isn't paranoia, it's precedent. They've done this before. Which means the Void Century isn't just old news being hidden. It's a threat they consider active, right now, in the present timeline. That seems like plenty of mystery for one story. Except we haven't even gotten to the Ancient Kingdom yet. The Ancient Kingdom. A nation that, according to the little bits of dialogue Oda has let slip over the years, existed during the Void Century and stood, somehow, against the very forces that would go on to found the world government. Most fans hear Ancient Kingdom and picture something small, a city-state maybe, a rebellion that got crushed. Except the more you piece together, the more it looks like this wasn't a rebellion at all. It looks like it was the dominant power of its era, one so significant that 20 kingdoms had to unite just to bring it down. Think about that number for a second. 20 kingdoms. Not 2, not 5. 20 separate ruling powers, each with their own armies, their own pride, their own reasons to distrust each other, all deciding the Ancient Kingdom was dangerous enough to justify putting every difference aside. That's not how you respond to a minor threat. That's how you respond to something that could have ended all of you individually. And here's the detail that quietly reframes everything. Those 20 kingdoms didn't just defeat the Ancient Kingdom. They founded the world government together, immediately afterward, as if the victory and the government were the same event. Which raises an uncomfortable question. Was the world government built to protect the world from something? Or was it built to make sure nobody ever found out what that something actually was? That question gets a lot heavier once you learn about Pluton, Poseidon, and Uranus, the 3 ancient weapons. For most of the series, they're treated like myths within the myth, super weapons whispered about by pirates who aren't even sure they're real. Except Oda has already confirmed, on the page, that all 3 exist. Pluton is a warship capable of leveling a nation. Poseidon turns out to be tied to the Sea Kings themselves. And Uranus is still, even now, mostly unexplained. Here's the detail that hardly anyone connects on a first read. These weapons weren't hidden by the Ancient Kingdom to protect them. They were feared enough that the world government has spent centuries trying to make sure nobody assembles all 3 under one flag. Which means the real story isn't find the weapons. It's figure out why an alliance of 20 kingdoms was so afraid of them that they buried the knowledge for 800 years. That fear becomes a lot more personal once you meet Joy Boy. For most of the series, Joy Boy is just a name on a poneglyph, a figure from the Void Century who apparently made a promise he couldn't keep and apologized for it centuries later in stone. Except the more the story unfolds, the more Joy Boy stops looking like a historical footnote and starts looking like a blueprint for Luffy himself. Not a metaphor, not a theme. An actual literal connection the story has been building towards since the beginning. Because here's the thing about Luffy's Devil Fruit. For most of the series, everyone, including Luffy, believed he'd eaten the Gum Gum fruit. A fairly simple ability. Rubber body, comedic durability, useful in a fight but nothing world-shattering. Except that's not what he ate. Not really. The truth, revealed decades into the story, is that Luffy's fruit is actually the human fruit, model Nika, a mythical Zoan, the strongest one in existence, according to characters who would know. And Nika isn't just powerful. Nika is described as the sun god, a being from folklore who existed purely to bring freedom to people who had none. A figure so threatening to those in power that the myth was buried, its true nature hidden behind a joke fruit for nearly 1,000 chapters, in a bit of foreshadowing so long game that most readers didn't even register it as foreshadowing until the reveal actually landed. Which means Luffy wasn't just given comedic rubber powers as a gag. He was given the literal power of a liberation god, and nobody, not even him, knew it for most of his life. That's the kind of long-term plotting that separates One Piece from stories that just make things up as they go. Oda has said the Nika reveal was planned from very early on, which means every stretchy gag, every over-the-top laugh, every moment that felt like comic relief was quietly building toward a god of freedom hiding in plain sight. But here's where things get even stranger. If Luffy is connected to Joy Boy, and Joy Boy made a promise during the Void Century that he couldn't keep, that raises the question of what that promise actually was. And the story has already dropped a hint bigger than most fans give it credit for. Zunisha, an elephant. Not a normal elephant, an elephant the size of an island, carrying an actual nation on its back, walking through the ocean for 1,000 years without stopping. At first glance, Zunisha feels like classic Oda absurdity, the kind of visual gag that makes One Piece instantly recognizable. Except Zunisha isn't wandering aimlessly. Zunisha is walking towards something specific, driven by a promise made centuries ago, tied directly to Joy Boy, tied directly to a debt that's never been repaid. That's the crazy part hardly anyone catches the first time through. A creature has been walking, without rest, for 1,000 years, because of a promise made in the 1 century of history the entire world was forced to forget. Which means the Void Century isn't just buried information, it's an active, ongoing consequence, still shaping the present, still owed. So we've got an ancient kingdom that terrified 20 nations, 3 weapons built to end wars, a sun god hidden inside a comedy pirate captain, and a walking island still trying to pay off a 1,000-year-old debt. That's already more mythology than most entire franchises build in their whole runtime. And we haven't even gotten to the government's own secret weapon yet, the one hiding in plain sight, disguised as an ordinary marine base. At first glance, Water 7 looks like nothing more than a shipbuilding town. Rivers, canals, a bunch of skilled carpenters obsessed with boats. Except buried underneath that town is a shipyard so old, so historically significant, that entire secret societies have been formed just to protect what it knows how to build. That shipyard is where the blueprints for Pluton were kept, generation after generation, passed down not by the government, but by regular shipwrights who had no idea what they were actually guarding. Tom, the legendary shipwright who trained both Frankie and the men who built the sea train, wasn't just a skilled craftsman. He was a keeper of one of the most dangerous secrets in the world, and he chose, deliberately, never to build the weapon himself. Here's the detail most fans miss on a first watch. Tom had the knowledge to construct an ancient weapon capable of destroying nations, and instead spent his life building trains and ferries. That's not a coincidence. That's a man who understood exactly what he was protecting people from by refusing to use it. Which makes Frankie's storyline hit very differently in hindsight. He's not just the crew's shipwright, he's the last known person connected to that lineage, meaning the knowledge to build Pluton is, quite literally, sitting inside the Straw Hat crew right now. That's the kind of long-term setup that doesn't pay off immediately, and that's exactly the point. Oda planted a live wire years before anyone needed it to matter. Poseidon turned out to be even more unexpected. For years, fans assumed it would be a weapon in the traditional sense. A ship, a cannon, something built with intent to destroy. Except, Poseidon isn't a machine at all. Poseidon is a person. Specifically, a princess with the ability to command the Sea Kings, the massive, ocean-dominating creatures most sailors spend their whole lives trying to avoid. That reveal recontextualizes an entire arc that on the surface looked like a fairly straightforward rescue mission in Fishman Island. Except the entire time, the story was quietly establishing that the weapon wasn't hidden in a vault somewhere. It had been walking around, scared and uncertain of her own power, the whole arc. Which is a detail that turns what looked like filler-adjacent world building into one of the most carefully placed setups in the entire series. And that leaves Uranus, still unexplained, still nameless in terms of what it actually is, which is exactly the kind of gap Oda tends to leave open for years before paying off. Given the pattern so far, a warship and a living person, there's a real chance Uranus won't be a weapon in the conventional sense either. It might be something nobody's even considered yet, hiding in plain sight the same way Poseidon did. At first glance, that's the last of the 3 weapons accounted for. Except, here's where things get interesting. Devil fruits themselves might be tied to the same ancient mystery, and the deeper you go, the less random superpower system they start to look like. Because here's a detail casual viewers tend to skip over completely. Devil fruits, according to the more knowledgeable characters in the story, are not natural. They're described as being born from the will of the sea itself, specifically as a kind of curse or countermeasure against a person the sea supposedly despises. That's an oddly personal detail for something that's treated, on the surface, like a simple power-up system for pirates. Which brings us to one of the biggest ongoing mysteries hiding inside a mechanic most viewers take for granted. Can someone eat more than one devil fruit? For most of the series, the answer was a hard no. Eating a second fruit kills you. Simple, brutal, non-negotiable. Except then, Blackbeard did it. Not once, but twice, and he's still alive, still walking around with 2 of the most dangerous fruits in the world stacked inside a single body. That shouldn't be possible under the rules the story spent decades establishing, and Oda has never let that contradiction slide by accident. Every unexplained rule break in this story tends to be a locked door with a key hidden somewhere else entirely. Here's the part that barely gets discussed. Blackbeard's own crewmates have openly speculated, in dialogue, that his body might not work the way a normal human's does, which means the rule about only eating 1 fruit might not be a rule about devil fruits at all. It might be a rule about human bodies specifically, and Blackbeard might not qualify as one in the way everyone assumes. That single implication turns him from the guy who broke the power system into something closer to a walking mystery about what he actually is, hiding behind one of the most famous grins in the entire series. And once you start questioning what devil fruits actually are, you start noticing something else. The fruits keep coming back. Here's something that sounds like a minor rule, but ends up carrying enormous emotional weight later. When someone with a devil fruit dies, the fruit doesn't disappear. It grows back somewhere in the world and eventually gets eaten by someone else, completely at random. At first, that just sounds like a convenient way to keep recycling powers so the story doesn't run out of new abilities. Except, once you watch it happen to specific, beloved characters, it stops feeling convenient and starts feeling almost cruel. Take Ace's Flame Fruit. After his death, it doesn't just vanish into story limbo. It resurfaces years later and ends up in the hands of an antagonist. Trafalgar Law inherited his Ope fruit not through random chance, but directly from Rocinante, one of the most quietly devastating relationships in the entire story. Except here's the detail that reframes the whole thing. The Ope fruit is described as the ultimate devil fruit, capable of granting eternal youth to whoever the user operates on at the cost of their own life. Rocinante never got to use that fruit's true power for himself. He died protecting a child who wasn't even his own. And the fruit's greatest ability, the one thing it can do that nothing else in the entire world can replicate, is still, to this day, unused. That's the kind of detail that turns a side character's tragic backstory into a ticking piece of narrative tension that's been sitting untouched for over 1,000 chapters. Which brings us to something almost nobody clocks the first time they hear about it. Devil Fruit Awakening. For most of the series, Awakening was treated as a rare, terrifying upgrade, something only the strongest zone users could reach, letting them affect the environment around them instead of just their own bodies. Except the deeper the story goes, the more it becomes clear that Awakening isn't unique to zones at all. Paramecia users can awaken too, and when they do, their powers stop being personal abilities and start reshaping the actual world around them. Doflamingo was the first real proof of that, turning an entire kingdom's floor into strings capable of controlling people against their will. That single fight quietly rewrote what the power ceiling of this entire series even was. Which means every devil fruit we've seen so far might have a hidden second form nobody's unlocked yet. A whole layer of the power system sitting dormant, waiting for the right amount of desperation or willpower to crack it open. And that idea connects directly to something even more fundamental than devil fruits: Haki. At first glance, Haki looks like a simple three-tier system. Observation, to sense danger. Armament, to hit things that shouldn't normally be hittable. Conquerors, the rare one. The one that lets a person overwhelm the will of everyone weaker around them just by existing. Except here's the detail that reframes the entire power structure of the story. Haki isn't something you're taught from a book. It's described as a latent ability every living person technically has, buried under fear, self-doubt, or simply never being pushed hard enough to need it. Which means, in theory, anyone in this world could unlock these abilities. The reason so few people do isn't a lack of potential. It's a lack of the exact kind of pressure required to break through their own limits. That's a detail that turns Haki from special power system into something closer to a metaphor running quietly under the entire story. That strength was never rare because of birth or talent. It was rare because most people never get pushed far enough to find it. Conqueror's Haki takes that idea even further. It's explicitly tied to willpower strong enough to affect others involuntarily, and historically, it's shown up almost exclusively in characters destined to lead, to rebel, or to break the world's rules entirely. Roger had it, Shanks has it, Luffy has it, and awakened it as a literal child, years before he ever set sail, which is a detail the story planted so early that most first-time viewers don't even remember it happened until they rewatch the beginning after finishing everything else. And that loops us right back to Shanks, a man who's been quietly pulling threads in this story since episode 1, and who might be far more involved in the entire plot than his laid-back attitude lets on. At first glance, Shanks looks like comic relief with a sword. He shows up in the very first episode, loses an arm to a sea monster protecting a kid nobody else believed in, and disappears from the main story for years at a time. Except almost nothing about that first scene is as simple as it looks. Shanks wasn't just some low-level pirate passing through. He was already, at the start of the story, powerful enough to make an Emperor of the Sea back down without throwing a single punch, which is a detail that gets easy to forget once you're used to seeing him as the friendly guy from Luffy's childhood. Here's the crazy part. Shanks has been in the room for nearly every major turning point in the entire series, and he's rarely the one people are watching. He was there when Ace and Luffy first crossed paths as children. He was the one who handed Luffy the very hat that becomes the emotional core of the entire story. He showed up at Marineford not to fight, but to end a war between two emperors with a single conversation. Something no Marine, no government official, and no other pirate in the story has ever managed to do. And after that war, he did something that barely got any attention at the time. He requested, and received, a private meeting with the 5 elders themselves. That's not a scene that happens for a background character. The 5 elders don't meet privately with random pirates. Whatever was discussed in that meeting has never been shown, and Oda has kept it that way for years, which is exactly the kind of silence that tends to be hiding something enormous in this story. Which brings us to the 5 elders themselves, and the figure standing above even them, Im. For most of the series, the world government looked like the final boss structure. 5 elders making decisions, backed by the celestial dragons, backed by the Marines. Except partway through the story, it's revealed that even the 5 elders answer to someone else. A figure sitting on an empty throne in the government's most sacred, most restricted room. A figure whose face has been deliberately kept hidden from readers for longer than most entire story arcs last. Here's the detail that reframes the entire political structure of the world. Im has the ability to erase a country from every official record, permanently, simply by burning its flag in a specific room. That's not a metaphorical threat. It's shown, on the page, being used against an actual, named kingdom in real time. which means the world government isn't just an oppressive bureaucracy at the top of this world. It's a system built entirely around the will of one hidden figure who can unmake nations without a single soldier being deployed. And here's where things get even stranger. Im is shown holding a weapon that lets them influence the massive Reverie Summit from a hidden vantage point, watching world leaders without any of them knowing they're being observed. Which means the story's biggest political mystery isn't just, who is Im? It's, how long has Im been quietly shaping every major decision in this world's history without anyone realizing there was a single hand behind the curtain the entire time? That single reveal recontextualizes decades of government behavior that used to look like simple institutional cruelty. The persecution of the Nefertari family's ideals in Alabasta, the destruction of O'Hara, the way certain kingdoms get crushed while others, just as rebellious, are quietly left alone. None of that reads the same once you know there's one figure at the very top who's been making these calls the entire time, unseen, unnamed, for who knows how long. Which loops back, in a strange way, to Shanks again. Because if Im is the true power behind the world government, and Shanks requested a private audience with the people who answered directly to Im, that meeting stops looking like a courtesy call between old acquaintances. It starts looking like two people at the absolute top of two opposing power structures, quietly comparing notes on something neither side wants the rest of the world to know about yet. And that's before we even get to what Shanks is hiding in that case he never opens. Shanks carries a case throughout the entire series that he never once opens on screen. And here's where we have to be careful, because this next part is still theory, not confirmed fact. Fans have noticed that the shape and size of that case closely resembles the container devil fruits are known to be transported in elsewhere in the story. The same kind of case used to move Ace's fruit before Whitebeard's crew got involved. Oda has never confirmed what's inside it. It could be a devil fruit. It could be something else entirely. But the visual parallel is close enough and deliberate enough that most longtime theorists don't think it's a coincidence, even without official confirmation. If it does turn out to be a fruit, the obvious question becomes, which one? And why an Emperor of the Sea would be personally transporting it instead of letting it simply resurface at random the way every other fruit in the story does. That would mean Shanks isn't just carrying cargo, he's protecting something specific from ending up in the wrong hands, which fits everything else we've learned about how careful and how quietly influential he's been the entire time. That's the last thread we'll pull on Shanks for now, because there's an entire crew's worth of buried history sitting closer to home. Take Zoro's swords. At first glance, they're just cool weapons, upgrades he collects along the journey like most action heroes do. Except each of his 3 swords carries its own history that quietly outweighs Zoro's own backstory in places. Enma, the sword he eventually wields, once belonged to Kozuki Oden, one of the most important figures in the entire Wano arc, a man whose death set off a chain of events that's still shaping the present story decades later. Wielding that blade isn't a power upgrade. It's Zoro inheriting a piece of a national tragedy, whether he fully understands that weight or not. And here's a detail that barely gets attention. Enma actively fights back against weaker users, draining their own strength as a kind of built-in test of worthiness. That's not just flavor text. It's the story quietly establishing that some weapons in this world aren't tools. They're judges, deciding in real time whether the person holding them deserves to. Sanji's backstory hides something even stranger. For most of the early series, he's just the chef with a tragic past and a complicated relationship with his family. Except once the Vinsmoke family gets properly introduced, that complicated relationship turns out to be an entire hidden layer of the world's power structure. Sanji was engineered, before birth, to be a genetically enhanced super soldier, along with his siblings, as part of an experiment meant to produce living weapons. Sanji is the only one of his siblings whose enhancements didn't fully take, which everyone around him treated as a failure for most of his life. Except here's the twist that flips the entire tragedy on its head. The reason Sanji still feels pain, still gets exhausted, still bleeds normally while his siblings don't, isn't a flaw. It's the reason he still has real empathy, real vulnerability, the very things that make him who he is. The story spent years building his backstory as a story about being unwanted, only to reveal that the thing making him defective is the exact thing that makes him human in a family that was engineered not to be. That's the kind of quiet reversal Oda does constantly. What looks like a weakness on page 1 turns out to be the entire point by the time the arc resolves. And that pattern shows up again once you dig into Wano, a country that looks, on the surface, like a fairly self-contained arc about defeating a tyrant. Except Wano turns out to be tangled directly into the Void Century, into the ancient weapons, into Roger's own personal history, in ways that recontextualize almost everything we thought we understood about the rest of the world. Here's something that sounds like a throwaway detail the first time you hear it. Gol D. Roger and Whitebeard both visited Wano, decades before the main story even begins, back when the country's borders were still open to the rest of the world. That's not a minor cameo in someone's backstory. That's two of the most powerful men to ever sail the Grand Line, independently deciding a small, isolated nation was worth their personal attention, long before anyone else in the world thought to care about it. The reason becomes clear once you meet Kozuki Oden, the shogun's son who left Wano specifically to sail with both of them, first under Whitebeard, then under Roger, eventually becoming part of the crew that reached Laugh Tale itself. Oden isn't just a tragic historical figure. He's one of the only people in the entire story confirmed to have stood at the final island, seen whatever's actually there, and lived long enough to come home and try to tell people about it. Except he never got the chance to fully explain what he saw. Oden was executed by Orochi and Kaido before he could pass that knowledge on, boiled alive in front of his own people for an hour, refusing to break, buying time so his retainers could survive. That execution isn't just an emotional gut punch for the arc. It's the story removing one of its only living witnesses to the ending, on purpose, decades before the ending itself arrives. Here's where it gets even stranger. Oden's wife, Toki, has the power to send people forward through time, and the only thing we know for certain is that she used it to send her own children, along with a small group of loyal retainers, 20 years into the future, specifically timed to arrive right as the story's main events were unfolding. That's not a coincidence built for convenience. That's the story planting a 20-year fuse decades before lighting it, timed with a precision most series never attempt even once, let alone as a background detail in someone else's arc. Which brings us to why Wano was sealed off from the rest of the world in the first place. Officially, it's framed as isolationist policy, a country protecting its culture from outside influence. Except the real reason turns out to be tied directly to a road poneglyph, one of the 4 specific stones needed to actually locate Laugh Tale. Wano isn't isolated by choice. It's isolated because it's sitting on a literal piece of the map to the ending, and the people in charge have spent generations making sure nobody outside the country ever gets close enough to read it. That reframes Kaido's entire presence in the arc. He's not just occupying Wano because it's a convenient base. He's sitting on top of one of the rarest, most valuable pieces of information in the entire world, guarded by a country that spent centuries hiding in plain sight, specifically so nobody would think to look. And Kaido himself hides a detail most casual viewers miss entirely. He's spent decades trying and failing to die, surviving falls, executions, and battles that should have killed anyone else a dozen times over, all while openly wondering out loud why he can't seem to end his own life no matter how hard he tries. That's not just a dark character quirk. It quietly connects him to a much older, much stranger group of beings we'll get to in a moment, one that recontextualizes what Emperor of the Sea might actually mean at the very top of the power scale. Because as strange as Wano's secrets are, they're nothing compared to what's been hiding on an island most of the world has never even heard of. A floating research base run by the single most important scientist in the entire story, holding secrets even the 5 elders are afraid of. Egghead Island looks, from a distance, like a fairly standard research facility. except it's home to the single smartest human being in the entire world. A scientist so far ahead of everyone else that the world government considers his knowledge a bigger threat than most emperors of the sea. Dr. Vegapunk isn't just brilliant, he's the reason Pacifista exist, the reason Seraphim exist, the reason the Marines have any chance at all of matching pirates who eat mythical devil fruits. Here's the detail that catches most people off guard the first time they hear it. Vegapunk isn't one person anymore. He's split himself into 6 separate satellites, each representing a different aspect of his personality and expertise, running independently, sometimes even disagreeing with each other in real time. That's not a gimmick. It's the story's way of literally externalizing the idea that even a single genius contains multitudes, conflicting instincts pulling in different directions. Except here, those instincts are walking around as separate bodies with their own opinions on whether their own research should even continue. One of those satellites, Punk-02 Shaka, has openly said on the page that Vegapunk knows the truth of the Void Century. All of it. Which means the single greatest unsolved mystery of the entire story might already be sitting, fully documented, inside a research facility surrounded by government soldiers ordered to erase it the moment anyone else gets close. And that facility hides something even stranger than stockpiled history. Ancient robots, built from ruins predating the current era entirely. One of which gets fully activated on screen, a towering machine calling itself by a name lifted straight from old mythology. That robot isn't treated as a modern invention, it's treated as a rediscovery, technology from a civilization advanced enough that the current world hasn't caught back up to it, even after 800 years of trying. Which loops directly into one of the strangest reveals in the entire back half of the story. The Lunarians, a race the world government's own leadership is directly descended from, tied to an ancient civilization that once had a presence connected to the moon itself. It gets even stranger from there. Members of this bloodline are shown surviving conditions that should be instantly fatal to any normal human, walking through fire without so much as flinching, hinting at wings and horns hidden beneath ordinary clothing. Here's where this connects back to something we brought up earlier without fully explaining it. Kaido's inability to die, no matter how hard he's tried, starts looking a lot less random once you learn the world government's oldest bloodlines are quietly non-human in ways nobody's fully explained yet. That doesn't mean Kaido is confirmed to be connected to them. That part is still theory. But the story has spent a lot of time establishing that human isn't as fixed a category in this world as it first appears, and every reveal like the Lunarians makes it a little more plausible that some of the story's strangest characters aren't fully human at all. That single research island, one most of the world doesn't even know exists, is quietly holding the answers to the Void Century, the origin of ancient technology, and the true nature of the people running the government from the shadows, which makes it one of the most dangerous places in the entire story. Not because of how strong anyone there is in a fight, but because of how much they already know. And knowing things in this world, as we're about to see, has never been safe. That idea that information itself can be a death sentence in this world runs quietly under almost every member of the Straw Hat crew, even the ones whose backstories look like simple emotional arcs on the surface. Take Nami. At first glance, her story is straightforward. A village terrorized by a fishman pirate, a mother who sacrifices herself, a young girl forced to work for the enemy to save the people she loves. Except the deeper detail hiding underneath that arc is easy to miss. Nami's real dream, drawing a complete map of the world, isn't just a personal goal. It's the exact kind of project the world government has spent centuries actively suppressing. A fully accurate world map would expose currents, hidden islands, and navigational secrets the government has quietly controlled access to for generations. Nami's dream job is, without her fully realizing it, a threat to the same information monopoly that got Ohara burned to the ground. Usopp hides something similar, his arc reads, on the surface, as a coward learning to be brave. Except his father, Yasopp, sails directly under Shanks, meaning Usopp has been 1 degree removed from one of the most quietly influential figures in the entire story since before the series even started. And Usopp's eventual identity as Sniper King during the Dressrosa arc isn't just a fun disguise. It's the story proving, structurally, that the weak member of the crew is capable of holding an entire kingdom's attention and hope on his own, foreshadowed for years by a habit of tall tales that turn out to have been rehearsal the whole time. Chopper's backstory carries a detail that gets easy to gloss over. He was rejected by both humans and reindeer for most of his life, belonging fully to neither group, before Hiraluk gave him a reason to keep going. That in-between existence, not fully accepted by either side of a divide, echoes a theme that shows up again and again across the entire story, in Robin's history with O'Hara, in Sanji's failed genetic engineering, in Jinbei's constant navigation between Fishman and human worlds. None of these characters are accidental variations on the same idea. Oda keeps returning to the theme of people caught between two worlds, unable to fully belong to either, because it's the same tension the entire story's central conflict is built on. Brook's backstory hides one of the loneliest details in the entire series, and one of the most quietly important. He spent decades alone on a ghost ship after his entire original crew died from poison, kept alive by his devil fruit's unique property of letting his soul return to his body after death. That's not just tragic flavor. It makes Brook, functionally, the only character in the story who has directly experienced dying and coming back, which becomes relevant in ways the story hasn't fully cashed in yet, given how many other characters have brushed dangerously close to death without ever crossing that same line. And Jinbei's arc carries the heaviest political weight of the entire crew, even though it rarely gets framed that way. As a former warlord and a fishman who spent his whole life fighting for equality between humans and his own people, Jinbei isn't just a strong swordsman with a soft-spoken personality. He's a living bridge between two of the story's oldest, deepest wounds: human supremacy and fishman discrimination, both of which trace directly back to decisions made during, or shortly after, the Void Century itself. Which means almost every member of this crew, without most of them realizing it, is personally connected to the exact same buried history the whole story keeps circling back to. That's not coincidence. That's a cast built, piece by piece, around a single hidden wound the entire world has spent 800 years trying to forget. And that wound runs even deeper once you start looking at the geography of the world itself, because even the ocean has been hiding secrets in plain sight. At first glance, the Grand Line just looks like the dangerous ocean where all the strongest pirates go to test themselves. Except the geography of this world was clearly designed with the same obsessive planning as everything else in the story. The world is shaped like a giant globe wrapped around a single, unbroken landmass called the Red Line, which crosses every ocean on the planet and physically separates the 4 seas from each other. No ship can sail around it. No ship can sail through it. It simply exists as a wall dividing the entire world into quarters. Cutting directly across that landmass, perpendicular to it, is the Grand Line itself, the one path connecting all 4 seas together, guarded on both ends by a mountain range so violent it's earned its own nickname among sailors: Reverse Mountain. A place where ocean currents flow uphill, which sounds like an exaggeration until you realize Oda drew it exactly that way. Currents visibly climbing a mountain to feed into a strait most conventional ships can't survive entering. Then there's the calm belts, 2 massive bands of ocean flanking the Grand Line on either side. Technically calm, windless, and current-free, which sounds harmless until you learn they're also the deep-sea territory of the largest sea kings in the entire world. Ships can't sail through because there's no wind to move them, and if they try rowing through anyway, they're usually swallowed before they get very far. Which means the Grand Line isn't just dangerous because of pirates. It's structurally, geographically, designed to be nearly impossible to enter or leave by any route except the one heavily monitored path everyone's forced to take. Here's the detail that reframes the entire setup. That structure isn't natural chaos. It's a choke point. Every single pirate crew serious about reaching the end of the Grand Line has to pass through the exact same narrow gates, monitored, tracked, and predictable. Which means the world government didn't need to control the whole ocean to control who gets close to the truth. They just needed to control the doorway. And even inside the Grand Line, normal navigation completely breaks down. Compasses don't work because of intense magnetic fields, forcing sailors to rely on a log pose instead, a compass that locks onto magnetic fields from nearby islands rather than pointing north. Which means, in the most dangerous ocean in the world, sailors can't even choose their own direction. They're forced to follow whatever island the log pose happens to be pointing toward next, turning the entire Grand Line into something closer to a fixed path than an open sea, no matter how much freedom it appears to offer on the surface. That tension, the illusion of freedom sitting on top of a heavily controlled structure, isn't just clever world building. It's the exact same idea the entire story keeps repeating at every level, from the ocean's geography down to individual characters' lives. Freedom that looks total until you notice the walls. Even the story's most famous unfulfilled dream fits that pattern. The All Blue, a legendary sea where all four oceans supposedly meet and mix together, has never been confirmed to exist by anyone in the story. It's treated the same way Laugh Tale used to be treated, whispered about, chased, doubted by nearly everyone except the person obsessed enough to believe in it. Sanji has spent his entire life searching for a place that might not even be real, which quietly mirrors Luffy's own journey toward a treasure nobody's fully certain still exists either. Which brings the story back, gently, to the same question it's been circling from the very first episode. What happens when someone finally proves the impossible thing was real the entire time? Every few years, the world's kings gather in secret for the Reverie, a summit where the leaders of every allied kingdom meet under the watch of the Celestial Dragons, the descendants of the 20 founding kings who created the world government in the first place. At first glance, that sounds like diplomacy, except almost nothing about the Reverie functions like normal diplomacy once you look closer. The Celestial Dragons don't attend as equals. They attend as the reason the summit exists at all, treated with a reverence bordering on religious worship, allowed to do essentially anything they want to anyone beneath them without consequence. That's not an exaggeration for dramatic effect. The story shows, directly, a celestial dragon shooting an unarmed civilian for the crime of accidentally bumping into him, and facing no punishment whatsoever. Which means the system isn't just unfair, it's built, structurally, to place a handful of bloodlines above basic human law entirely. Here's where that system finally cracks in a way the whole world can't ignore. Nefertari Cobra, King of Alabasta, and one of the most quietly principled rulers in the entire story, attempts to expose the truth of the Void Century at the Reverie itself, using knowledge he'd spent years gathering. He's assassinated before he can finish, silenced in the one place that's supposed to be the safest room in the entire world, surrounded by the leaders of every allied nation. That assassination isn't just a personal tragedy for his daughter, Vivi. It's proof, on the page, that even kings aren't safe from the same forces that erased an entire century of history and burned down Ohara. The people trying to protect the truth keep dying before they can share it, generation after generation, which means the mystery of the Void Century isn't just old information nobody's found yet. It's information actively, violently suppressed, right up to the present timeline, by people willing to kill a sitting king in front of his peers to keep it buried. Which brings us to the Revolutionary Army, and the man leading it, Monkey D. Dragon, Luffy's father, a character who's appeared on screen for years while remaining almost entirely unexplained. Here's the detail that's easy to miss on a first read. Dragon isn't framed as a villain, but he's also never given a clean, heroic introduction either. The story keeps him deliberately ambiguous, a man leading an organization dedicated to tearing down the exact same government that's been hiding the Void Century, assassinating kings, and burning down islands full of scholars. And the fact that Luffy, the eventual Pirate King candidate, and Dragon, the leader of the group actively trying to dismantle the government from within, are father and son, has never once been meaningfully explored on screen. They've never had a real conversation. Luffy barely knows him, which means one of the most important relationships in the entire story has been sitting completely dormant for over 1,000 chapters, waiting for a payoff Oda has never rushed toward, even when it would have been the easiest emotional beat in the world to cash in early. That's not an oversight. That's restraint from a writer who's shown, over and over, that he's willing to let threads sit untouched for decades if the ending needs them to land at exactly the right moment instead of the convenient one. And Dragon isn't even the only member of that family working against the government from the inside. Garp, Luffy's grandfather, has spent his entire life as a Marine hero, famous for cornering Roger himself, while quietly refusing every promotion to Admiral he's ever been offered. A man that powerful, that respected, deliberately staying in a lower position his whole career isn't just humility. It's another quiet refusal to fully serve a system he's never seemed entirely comfortable with either. The Marines themselves hide a similar kind of quiet contradiction at the top. Sengoku, the fleet admiral during the Marineford War, spent his entire career enforcing the government's version of justice, yet he's also the one who ultimately allowed Luffy's escape after the war, choosing not to pursue him with everything the Marines had left. That's a strange decision for a man defined by absolute justice, unless you consider that even the people running the system sometimes recognize when following it further would only cause more damage than it prevents. Akainu's rise to fleet admiral afterward represents the opposite philosophy taking control. Where Sengoku occasionally showed restraint, Akainu is defined by an unwavering belief that justice requires absolute, merciless enforcement. No exceptions, no mercy, no room for the kind of quiet compromises Garp or Sengoku were willing to make. His promotion, directly after the war that killed Ace and nearly killed Luffy, signals a hardening of the entire government's approach going forward, a shift the story has been slowly showing the consequences of ever since. That shift matters because it changes what kind of threat the world government actually poses going into the story's final stretch. Under Sengoku, there was at least some flexibility, some officers willing to bend rules quietly. Under Akainu, that flexibility disappears, replaced by a leadership structure with almost no tolerance left for the kind of gray areas that used to let characters like Garp operate without direct confrontation. Which brings the story's biggest remaining wildcard into focus, Blackbeard. Unlike almost every other major antagonist, Blackbeard has never been interested in ruling, controlling territory, or even revenge in any conventional sense. His entire goal, stated outright, is finding the strongest power in the world and taking it for himself, regardless of who it belongs to or what it costs him. He murdered his own crewmate to steal a devil fruit. He handed Ace over to the government simply to gain access to Impel Down, a move that indirectly set off the entire war that killed thousands of people. Here's the detail that makes him uniquely dangerous compared to every other Emperor of the Sea. Blackbeard doesn't have a code. Roger had one. Whitebeard had one. Even Kaido, for all his destruction, believed in something resembling a worldview. Blackbeard's only consistent trait across the entire story is opportunism, taking whatever power happens to be unguarded at the right moment, which makes him almost impossible to predict using the same logic that explains everyone else's motivations. And given everything we've covered, the buried history, the ancient weapons, the hidden bloodlines, a character whose entire goal is accumulating power with zero ideological limits might end up being the single most dangerous unresolved thread heading into the story's ending. Not because he's the strongest character in the story right now, but because he's shown repeatedly that he's willing to go further than anyone else to take what he wants, with absolutely nothing holding him back. Which raises an uncomfortable question the story still hasn't answered. If Luffy is inheriting Joy Boy's unfinished promise, and the government is hiding under Eam's unchallenged control, where exactly does a man with no code and two of the most dangerous devil fruits in the world fit into how this entire story is supposed to end? That question loops naturally into one of the last major pieces of the world still waiting to be explored: Elbaf, the legendary island of giants. For most of the series, Elbaf has existed purely as a rumor, a place the Straw Hats have promised to visit but never actually reached, mentioned just often enough to keep the promise alive without ever paying it off. Here's what makes that promise carry more weight than a simple travel destination. Giants in this world aren't treated as generic fantasy creatures. They're shown repeatedly living by an intensely rigid warrior code, one built around loyalty, honor, and an almost sacred respect for promises made between friends. Dory and Bragi, two giants introduced early in the story, spend literal decades locked in a duel neither of them can remember the original reason for, refusing to stop out of sheer stubborn respect for the fight itself. That's not just a joke about giant strength. It's the story's first real glimpse into a culture built entirely around honoring commitments long after their original meaning has been forgotten, which makes Elbaf, when the story finally arrives there, likely to hit differently than any other island visited so far. Every other nation the crew has passed through has been shaped in some way by the government's influence, whether through direct occupation or centuries of quiet control. Elbaf, as far as the story has shown, has largely existed outside that reach, which means it might be one of the last places in the world still operating by rules the Void Century never managed to erase. And that theme, honoring old promises that outlive the people who made them, quietly connects back to nearly everything covered so far. Zunisha, still walking after 1,000 years. Toki, sending her children forward through time to finish a fight she couldn't win herself. Roger, dying publicly so someone else could finish what he started. Odin, buying his retainers 20 years with his own execution. This story isn't just built on mysteries stacked on top of mysteries. It's built on the idea that the right promise, made with enough conviction, can outlast the person who made it by centuries, and still end up mattering the moment the right person finally picks up the thread. Even Luffy's own straw hat carries that exact weight. A hat given to him as a child by a man he barely knew at the time, with one simple condition: bring it back someday, once he's become a great pirate in his own right. That hat has survived storms, wars, and near-death experiences that destroyed almost everything else Luffy's carried across his journey, and the story has never let it break in any way that couldn't be repaired. That's not an accident of plot armor. It's the same theme playing out on the smallest, most personal scale imaginable. A promise, tied to an object, carried carefully across an entire ocean, waiting for the day it finally gets to matter. Stepping back from the world itself for a moment, it's worth asking how any of this got planned this precisely in the first place. And the answer says almost as much about Oda as it does about the story. Oda has talked in interviews over the years about writing the ending of One Piece long before most of the current cast even existed on paper. Not a vague idea of how it should feel. An actual, specific ending, kept private, referenced constantly while writing everything that leads up to it. That's an unusual way to build a story this long. Most long-running series figure things out as they go, adjusting based on popularity, extending arcs that work, and cutting ones that don't. Oda's approach is closer to reverse engineering. Start with where the story has to land, then build every single arc as a stepping stone toward that fixed point, even when it means burying a detail for over a decade before it becomes relevant. That process explains why so many throwaway details in early One Piece turn out to matter later. Oda has said more than once that when he draws something into a chapter, it's not just background flavor, it's information. If a flag appears in the corner of a panel, there's a reason. If a random NPC gets an unusual name, there's a reason. That habit is part of why rewatching or rereading early arcs after finishing more recent chapters feels like an entirely different experience. Details that looked like harmless world building the first time through suddenly read like quiet confirmations of things the story hadn't officially revealed yet. Names carry an especially heavy amount of that hidden intention. Almost every major character's name connects to something, whether it's historical piracy, mythology, or wordplay that doesn't always translate cleanly. Devil fruits follow their own internal naming logic too, where the actual ability is often disguised behind a deliberately misleading, joke-sounding name. The same trick used with Luffy's own fruit for nearly the entire series. That's not laziness in the naming convention. It's the same long con storytelling technique applied at the smallest possible scale, hiding real information behind something that sounds too silly to take seriously. Wano itself is one of the clearest examples of Oda pulling directly from real mythology and folklore, rather than inventing everything from scratch. The entire arc borrows heavily from the legend of Momotaro, the Peach Boy, a Japanese folk hero who teams up with animal companions to defeat a group of Oni, demon-like creatures, on an island called Onigashima. Compare that to Luffy's own crew, made up of humans, alongside a reindeer, a skeleton, a cyborg, and a fishman, storming an island literally named Onigashima to take down Kaido, a character repeatedly associated with Oni imagery throughout the entire arc. That's not a loose inspiration. That's Oda openly building an entire saga as an expanded, high-stakes retelling of one of the most famous folktales in Japanese culture, confident enough in the source material that he barely needs to hide the parallel. That same respect for cultural inspiration shows up constantly across the series, less as direct references and more as a kind of textured borrowing, myths and history reshaped just enough to fit a world made of oceans, pirates, and devil fruits, while still keeping enough of the original spirit that longtime fans of Japanese folklore tend to recognize the bones underneath the surface almost immediately. Behind all of that meticulous planning is a work schedule that's become almost as legendary as the story itself. Oda has spoken openly about working long hours with very little sleep for most of the manga's run, a pace that eventually forced him to scale back his weekly schedule after decades of pushing through it. That kind of sustained output, week after week, year after year, while still tracking hundreds of characters and planting details that won't pay off for a decade, is part of why fans treat One Piece less like a typical weekly manga and more like a single, continuous act of endurance from one creator who's rarely taken a real break since the story began. Character designs carry their own layer of hidden intention too. Many of the crew's earliest looks went through significant redesigns before the story locked in the versions fans know today. And Oda has talked about drawing inspiration from real actors, musicians, and historical figures for various characters, rather than inventing faces purely from imagination. That habit of grounding even fantastical characters in something real is part of why the cast, despite being enormous, rarely feels visually repetitive even decades into the series. The anime adaptation adds its own layer to the story's history, and it's worth separating out from the manga itself, since the two don't always move in lockstep. Filler arcs, original content created specifically for the anime and not present in Oda's manga, have occasionally been necessary to let the source material catch up, and longtime fans generally treat those stretches as optional detours rather than canon in the way manga chapters are. That distinction matters for anyone trying to untangle what's officially part of Oda's planned story versus what exists purely to keep a weekly broadcast schedule filled. One Piece has also quietly become one of the best-selling manga series in history, and Oda's personal, handwritten answers to fan questions in the print volumes, a recurring feature where he responds directly to reader mail with his own commentary and jokes, have become almost as beloved as the story itself among longtime readers. That direct, personal connection between creator and audience is part of why the fan base treats Oda less like a distant studio executive and more like someone genuinely still in the trenches with them, chapter by chapter, plot twist by plot twist. All of which brings the story's craftsmanship back to its central figure. Because for as much mystery as this story buries in its world, its history, and its side characters, the most quietly complex character in the entire cast might still be the one who looks the simplest on paper. Luffy is, by design, one of the least psychologically complicated protagonists in modern shonen storytelling. He wants meat, adventure, and his friends to be happy. That simplicity used to get mistaken, especially by newer viewers, for shallow writing. Except the longer the story runs, the more that simplicity reveals itself as one of the most deliberate character choices in the entire series. Not a limitation Oda was working around, but the actual point. Here's the detail that reframes everything about him. Luffy's core values never change. Not once across the entire story. He doesn't develop a darker side. He doesn't get seduced by power. He doesn't compromise his beliefs under pressure, the way protagonists in similarly long stories often do to manufacture drama. What changes is everything happening around him. Kingdoms falling, governments exposed, decade-old conspiracies unraveling, while Luffy himself remains almost eerily consistent. A fixed point the entire story orbits, rather than a character being shaped by it. That consistency becomes a lot more meaningful once you connect it back to Nika, the sun god whose entire mythological purpose was bringing simple, uncomplicated freedom to people who had none. A god that doesn't scheme, doesn't manipulate, doesn't play politics, just directly, physically breaks whatever's oppressing people in front of him. Luffy's simplicity isn't a writing shortcut, it's thematically load-bearing. A more complicated, more conflicted protagonist couldn't carry that specific mythological role nearly as convincingly. That same directness shows up in how Luffy actually fights. Across the entire series, he almost never wins through trickery, poison, or exploiting an opponent's weakness in an underhanded way. Even against enemies who fight dirty, Luffy tends to match escalating power with escalating power, refusing, again and again, to win any other way. That's not just a character quirk. It's the story quietly reinforcing that its central hero represents strength used honestly, in direct contrast to nearly every major villain who tend to win through manipulation, fear, or systems rigged in their favor long before a fight even starts. And his goal reflects that same directness. Luffy has said outright, more than once, that being Pirate King isn't really about ruling anything. It's about being the most free person in the world. Not the strongest, not the richest, the freest. Which means his entire journey, wrapped in pirate adventure and devil fruit battles, is ultimately built around one of the simplest, most universal desires a person can have. Chasing a version of freedom nobody else has fully achieved, in a world engineered, top to bottom, by people desperate to make sure nobody ever does. That's the quiet tension sitting underneath every single mystery covered so far. An ancient kingdom crushed for threatening the status quo. A century of history erased to protect it. A government built specifically to prevent anyone from becoming too free, too powerful, or too aware. And walking directly into the middle of all of it, completely unbothered, is a rubber pirate who just wants to eat meat, protect his friends, and see what's over the next horizon. Roger's old crew carries its own scattered trail of mysteries, mostly because Oda has let them exist in the story's background for years without fully explaining what any of them are actually doing now. Silvers Rayleigh, the crew's first mate, spent years hiding in plain sight as a coding mechanic in Water 7 before revealing himself, casually, as one of the strongest living swordsmen in the world. His decision to train Luffy personally, for free, on nothing but the strength of a resemblance to his old captain, is one of the clearest signals the story gives that the past isn't finished with the present. It's actively reaching forward to shape it. Buggy might be the strangest thread of all. For most of the early series, he's played almost entirely for laughs. A clown pirate with a devil fruit that lets him split his body apart, constantly undermined by his own crew and his own ego. Except Buggy sailed with Roger. He was there for the Void Century's closest living witnesses, present for conversations we've never been shown. And decades later, through a chain of accidents so absurd they read like the story is making fun of its own mythology, Buggy ends up positioned as one of the most powerful figures in the underworld, propped up by reputation, misunderstanding, and sheer chaotic luck, rather than any real strength of his own. That's not filler. That's Oda using the funniest character in the cast to quietly satirize how reputation, fear, and rumor shape power in this world just as much as actual strength does. Buggy becomes dangerous not because he's strong, but because everyone else believes he is, which says something uncomfortable about how the entire pirate era's hierarchy of fear actually works underneath the surface. Even Roger's crew's less prominent members, Crocus, the ship's doctor turned lighthouse keeper, or Scopper Gabon, glimpsed only briefly, carry the same quiet implication. These are people who watched Roger's entire journey unfold, who know exactly what happened at Laugh-Tale, scattered across the world, mostly retired, mostly silent. The story could have killed them off to remove loose ends. Instead, it's kept them alive, tucked into corners of the map, as if their knowledge might still matter before everything's finished. Which brings the story's structure into sharper focus the further along it goes. Nearly every mystery covered here, the Void Century, the ancient weapons, the Lunarians, Roger's old crew, isn't sitting in isolation. They're all converging, slowly, deliberately, toward the same handful of locations and the same handful of remaining answers. Which is exactly what you'd expect from a story whose ending was written before most of its middle chapters existed. Even something as simple as a pirate flag carries more intention in this story than it first appears to. Every major crew's Jolly Roger is a variation on the classic skull and crossbones, except modified just enough to say something specific about who's flying it. The Straw Hat's flag isn't just a skull wearing Luffy's hat. It's a direct visual statement of identity, claiming the hat itself as part of the crew's core symbol before most viewers even understand why that hat matters as much as it does. Whitebeard's flag replaces the traditional crossbones with a mustache shape underneath the skull, a small, almost playful detail that quietly reinforces his image as a father figure first and a fearsome pirate second. Kaido's flag swaps the human skull for an Oni's head entirely, openly announcing his connection to the same demon imagery Wano's entire arc is built around, before the story ever explicitly draws that line for the audience. None of these are random design choices. Every flag functions as a tiny, compressed thesis statement about the crew flying it, readable at a glance by anyone who knows how to look. That same layer of hidden intention runs through One Piece's cover art, particularly the ongoing tradition of one-shot covers checking in on side characters between major arcs. These covers often quietly answer whatever happened to questions for characters who haven't appeared in the main story for years, showing them living their lives, running businesses, raising families, completely disconnected from the main plot, but still, technically, part of the same living world. It's a level of long-term care for background characters that most stories this size simply don't bother maintaining, and it reinforces something important about how Oda treats his own world. Nobody's story ends just because the camera stopped following them. That same care extends to Fishman Island's history, one of the story's more openly uncomfortable arcs, dealing directly with generations of discrimination against fishmen and merfolk at the hands of human society. The story doesn't soften that history for the sake of adventure pacing. Slavery, segregation, and generational trauma are treated with real weight, tied directly back to decisions made during and after the Void Century, reinforcing once again that almost every present-day injustice in this world traces back to the same buried century of history the government has spent 800 years trying to keep everyone from fully understanding. Which means even the story's most colorful, most seemingly light-hearted elements, a pirate flag, a background cover gag, a fishman's backstory, are quietly reinforcing the exact same central idea the entire series keeps circling back to from every possible angle. That the world as it currently exists was built on something deliberately hidden, and every corner of it, no matter how small, still carries the fingerprints of that original cover-up. The Warlord system, officially known as the Shichibukai, existed for years as one of the government's most openly hypocritical institutions. And the story never really hid that fact, even while most characters treated it as normal. The entire premise was simple: pardon dangerous pirates in exchange for their loyalty, essentially legalizing piracy for anyone powerful enough to be useful. Doflamingo ran an entire slave trade and weapons operation under the government's nose the whole time he held the title. Crocodile plotted to overthrow an allied kingdom while technically working for the very government protecting that kingdom. That's not the system failing. That's the system working exactly as intended. The warlords were never about justice. They were about controlling dangerous variables by giving them just enough freedom to stay useful. A strategy that only makes sense once you remember this is the same government willing to erase entire countries and assassinate kings to protect a single buried secret. Actual justice was never really the point. Control was. Impel Down reinforces that same idea from a different angle. Officially, it's the world's most secure prison, holding the worst criminals alive. Except several of its residents, Emporio Ivankov chief among them, aren't there purely as punishment. They're there because of what they know, or who they're connected to, tucked away in a facility specifically designed to make sure dangerous information stays as buried as dangerous people. And that brings us back, one more time, to the Five Elders, because a relatively recent reveal reframes almost everything covered about them so far. Each of the Five Elders is shown, eventually, capable of transforming into an ancient, mythical zone form, animals extinct in the current era, creatures the rest of the world has never even seen outside of fossils. That's not a minor power boost for dramatic effect. It means the five people running the world government from the shadows have access to devil fruits so rare, so ancient, that finding even one of them should be a near impossible coincidence, let alone five, concentrated entirely within the same five-person council. Which raises the obvious question the story hasn't fully answered yet. Are those fruits being deliberately hoarded, generation after generation, specifically kept out of circulation so nobody outside the Elders' bloodlines ever gets access to that level of power? If devil fruits really do resurface randomly after their user's death, the odds of 5 separate ancient zones, all ending up concentrated at the very top of the same organization, stop looking random almost immediately. That single detail turns the 5 Elders from mysterious old men in robes into something closer to a hidden apex predator class, sitting above even the Emperors of the Sea in raw, ancient power, hoarding not just political control, but the rarest fuel for strength in the entire world, kept locked away from everyone else for reasons the story still hasn't fully revealed. Few characters carry as much quiet tragedy as Bartholomew Kuma, and for most of the series, he's presented as little more than a silent, terrifying enforcer for the government, someone the Straw Hats fear without understanding. Except once his backstory finally gets told, that silence gets recontextualized into something devastating. Kuma was once a revolutionary himself, a kind man from a kingdom built entirely on slavery, someone who fought against the exact same oppressive systems Dragon's organization still fights today. Here's the detail that makes his transformation so quietly horrifying. Kuma didn't become the government's weapon by choice in any meaningful sense. He agreed to have his body converted into something closer to a living pacifista prototype, specifically to fund medical treatment for a dying friend, sacrificing his own free will, memory, and autonomy for someone else's survival. Every act of violence he's shown committing under government orders happens with a man who, underneath the surgical modifications, never stopped being the same person willing to give up everything for the people he cares about. That sacrifice becomes even more layered once you factor in his role protecting Jewelry Bonnie, a character whose full connection to Kuma stays deliberately vague for years before the story finally starts pulling that thread tight. A silent, weaponized government enforcer, quietly working against his own captors from the inside, using the last scraps of free will he has left to protect the one person who might actually matter to him. That's not a minor side character detail. That's one of the most quietly devastating arcs in the entire story, hiding behind a character most casual viewers wrote off early as just another intimidating background figure. And Kuma's story connects to a pattern that shows up again and again across this entire world. Characters whose surface-level menace is actually protecting something underneath it. Robin's cold demeanor as a child hiding unbearable grief. Zoro's harsh training style hiding real loyalty. Even Sengoku's rigid adherence to justice occasionally cracking just enough to let mercy through. This story rarely lets anyone stay exactly what they appear to be on a first impression, which is part of why rereading it after finishing tends to feel like discovering an entirely different, more devastating version of the same events. Momonosuke carries a similar weight, though his story is really about inheritance rather than sacrifice. Sent 20 years into the future by his own mother, he arrives as a child forced to somehow live up to his father Odin's legacy while barely remembering him at all. That's an enormous burden for a character the story initially plays for comic relief, all high-pitched panic and childish overreactions, before slowly revealing just how much quiet pressure he's actually carrying underneath it. His eventual devil fruit ability, letting him transform into an actual dragon, isn't just a cool late-arc power reveal. Dragons carry deep symbolic weight throughout East Asian mythology as figures of authority, protection, and legitimate rule, which means Momonosuke transforming into one isn't just a visual spectacle during the Wano climax. It's the story visually confirming, without needing to say it outright, that he's grown into someone capable of actually carrying his father's legacy forward, not as a copy of Odin, but as his own version of the same conviction. Sabo's story hits a different kind of emotional note entirely, built around identity rather than inheritance. Presumed dead for most of the series after a childhood tragedy involving a celestial dragon's ship, Sabo actually survived, but lost his memories in the process, erasing his entire connection to Luffy and Ace for years without any of them knowing the other was still alive. When he finally resurfaces, it's revealed he's become one of the Revolutionary Army's top commanders, working directly under Dragon this whole time, completely unaware of who he used to be. Here's the detail that turns his return into one of the story's most gut-wrenching moments, rather than a simple, happy reunion. Sabo regains his memories at almost the exact same moment Ace dies at Marineford, meaning he spends years without any connection to his childhood family, only to reconnect with it in the same instant he learns one of his two sworn brothers is already gone. And later, Sabo ends up inheriting Ace's devil fruit, the Flame fruit, the exact power his brother died wielding, carrying it forward not as a coincidence, but as a direct continuation of a promise the three of them made as children, to always look out for each other, no matter how far apart the world pushed them. That's the same thread running through nearly every major relationship in this story. Nobody's connection ends just because the plot moves them apart, or even because one of them dies. Somehow, some way, the story finds a way to let those bonds keep mattering, keep echoing forward, long after the moment that created them has passed. For most of the story, the balance of power at the top of the pirate world felt almost permanently fixed. 4 emperors, untouchable, dividing the most dangerous waters of the world between them, a hierarchy so stable it barely seemed like something the story would ever meaningfully disrupt. Except that stability was always an illusion, built on top of exactly the same kind of hidden fragility everything else in this world turns out to have. Kaido's defeat in Wano doesn't just remove one emperor from the board, it signals, structurally, that the entire era those 4 names represented is ending. Big Mom's decline follows a similar pattern. Her once untouchable crew fractured, her own power weakened in ways that would have been unthinkable earlier in the story. And into that vacuum steps a new, stranger lineup entirely. Buggy, propelled into emperor status almost entirely by reputation and coincidence rather than raw strength. Blackbeard, consolidating stolen power with 0 ideological limits, and eventually, Luffy himself, a rookie who spent the entire story being underestimated, suddenly occupying a seat that used to belong exclusively to legends. That shift matters because it's not framed as a simple changing of the guard. It's framed as the literal end of an era. The same phrase the story has used again and again to describe transitions this significant. The age of Roger ending with his execution. The age of the old emperors ending with Wano's fall. Each transition in this story tends to be loud, violent, and impossible to ignore, which makes the current shift feel less like routine plot movement and more like the story's final act quietly announcing itself has already begun. And that reshuffling connects directly back to everything we've covered so far, because a new era means new opportunities for exactly the kind of secrets the world government has spent 800 years protecting to finally slip loose. Fewer entrenched emperors means fewer stable alliances the government can quietly manage. More unpredictable power means less certainty about who ends up standing at Laugh-Tale when the story's central mystery finally gets its answer. Which brings this entire mountain of interconnected mysteries back around to where it started. A boy who wants to be free. A treasure that might be singular rather than a pile of gold. A century of history somebody was willing to kill kings and burn islands to keep buried. And an entire world, quietly, slowly, converging on the same handful of remaining answers. After decades of buildup, most viewers didn't even realize was buildup until they looked back and saw the whole shape of it laid out at once. One of the most quietly important pieces of Fishman history in the entire story belongs to Fisher Tiger, a name that barely comes up outside Jinbei's own backstory, despite shaping decades of the world's underlying tension. Tiger was a former slave who broke into Marie Jua itself, the government's most heavily guarded stronghold, and freed every enslaved person held there, fishmen and humans alike, in an act of rebellion that should have made him a legend across the entire world. Except here's the detail that quietly reveals how selectively this world remembers its own history. Tiger's raid gets buried, downplayed, treated by most of society as an act of piracy rather than liberation, while the horrors he was actually responding to, generations of fishmen and merfolk sold as property, barely register as historical fact to most surface dwellers at all. That imbalance isn't an accident. It's the same pattern the Void Century runs on, just playing out on a smaller, more recent scale. The people in power get to decide which atrocities become history and which ones get quietly written off as isolated incidents. Tiger's own trauma from his time enslaved eventually curdles into something darker within the Sun Pirates he founded, driving a wedge between fishmen who still believed coexistence with humans was possible and those who didn't. Jinbei stayed loyal to the idea of peaceful coexistence, even as his own captain's dying wish pushed the crew toward hatred instead. That split, playing out entirely among a crew of characters most casual viewers barely remember, quietly explains the entire ideological tension running underneath Fishman Island's arc years later, and underneath Jinbei's own quiet insistence throughout the whole story that humans and fishmen can still build something better together, which is, in its own smaller way, the exact same fight Luffy's entire journey represents on a much larger scale. Somebody gets hurt by a broken system. That person has to decide whether the answer is tearing everything down out of justified rage or trying, against every reasonable expectation, to build something better instead. This story asks that question constantly, through Tiger, through Robin, through Kuma, through Sabo, through nearly every character who's ever had a real reason to give up on the world exactly as it currently exists. And the fact that so many of them, eventually, choose to keep trying anyway, might be the closest thing this entire, sprawling mystery box of a story has to a single, unifying answer underneath everything else. Which brings the story back, one more time, to Ohara. Because that single destroyed island might be the clearest example in the entire series of how a single moment of kindness can quietly outlive an entire tragedy. When the government's buster call wiped out the island, a giant vice admiral named Saul, who'd secretly been helping the scholars in their research, found a young Robin fleeing the destruction and told her something the story keeps circling back to for the rest of its runtime. That she had the right to live. That being born wasn't a mistake, no matter what the rest of the world had decided to label her as. Saul dies protecting her that same day, giving Robin just enough time to escape a massacre that should have killed her too. And for the next 2 decades, Robin carries that single sentence with her like armor. Through mercenary work, through manipulation by dangerous employers, through a life spent believing she was fundamentally unwanted by the entire world. Until Luffy, without even knowing about Saul or Ohara, ends up proving that same idea true all over again, by refusing to let her die alone on Eni's lobby. That's the pattern, laid bare, running underneath almost everything covered across this entire mountain of interconnected mysteries. Oden buys Momonosuke 20 years of borrowed time. Tiger's rebellion echoes forward into Jinbei's lifelong belief that coexistence is worth fighting for. Saul's single sentence keeps a traumatized child believing she deserves to exist until decades later, an entire crew finally proves it. Even Roger's public execution functions the same way. A single act designed specifically to plant something in the world that wouldn't fully bloom until long after he was gone. None of these moments resolve quickly. None of them pay off in the same arc they're planted in. That's not accidental pacing. That's the entire philosophy this story runs on, articulated over and over through completely different characters in completely different circumstances. That the right words, the right sacrifice, the right promise, planted at exactly the right moment, can keep mattering decades later, long after the person who planted it is gone, dead, or forgotten by everyone except the one person it was meant for. Which is, when you step back far enough, probably the real reason this story has managed to hold so many mysteries, so many buried histories, so many quietly devastating character arcs together in one place for this long without any of it collapsing under its own weight. Every single thread, no matter how far apart it started, was always being built toward the exact same handful of ideas. Which finally brings this all the way back to Laugh Tale itself, the one place in the entire story every single thread we've covered eventually leads back to. Roger stood there, Whitebeard stood there, Oden stood there, and every single one of them came back changed, unwilling or unable to fully explain what they'd actually seen. Here's where we have to be honest about the line between confirmed fact and fan theory, because this is the one mystery the story has protected more carefully than almost any other. We know Laugh Tale requires all 4 road poneglyphs to locate. We know it sits at the very end of the Grand Line, past even the New World. We know the treasure there is called the One Piece, and we know, from that earlier detail about the title itself, that One Piece implies something singular rather than a simple hoard of gold. Beyond that, everything is theory. Some fans believe the true treasure isn't an object at all, but the complete, unerased history of the Void Century itself, finally assembled in one place. The ultimate answer to a mystery the government spent 800 years trying to bury. Others believe it's tied directly to Joy Boy's original promise, something capable of finally repaying the debt Zunisha has been walking toward for 1,000 years. Neither of those is confirmed. Both are plausible enough that longtime theorists take them seriously, and Oda has never shot either one down directly, which, in a story this carefully controlled, tends to mean something, even if it's impossible to say exactly what yet. What we do know for certain is that Roger's reaction to finding it wasn't disappointment, and it wasn't triumph either. It was laughter. Loud enough, apparently, that it's part of the reason the island now carries the name it does. A grown man, the single most powerful pirate of his generation, standing at the end of the greatest journey anyone had ever completed, and the first thing he did was laugh. That single detail might be the most quietly important piece of foreshadowing in this entire story, buried under decades of mystery, war, and tragedy. Whatever's actually waiting at the end of this journey, the story seems to be telling us, in advance, that the correct reaction to finally understanding it isn't grief, or fear, or even relief. It's laughter. The exact same reaction Luffy's had to nearly everything this entire journey has thrown at him so far. Underneath every ancient weapon, every hidden bloodline, every century of buried history, the thing that actually keeps this story grounded, the thing that makes an audience care about a rubber pirate's laugh at the end of the world, has always been the crew itself. Not the mysteries, the people standing next to Luffy while he solves them. That's easy to lose track of after spending this much time on poneglyphs and ancient weapons and hidden governments, so it's worth saying plainly. Every major arc in this story ends the same way, structurally, no matter how different the villain or the stakes. Someone gets hurt. The crew doesn't leave. That's it. That's the entire emotional engine underneath a story this massive. Robin nearly dies believing nobody would come for her, and the entire crew comes anyway, defying a government stronghold to prove her wrong. Sanji nearly loses himself to a family that only ever saw him as a failed weapon, and the crew simply refuses to let that definition stick. Frankie spends years believing the people who loved him were better off without the burden of his presence, and gets shown, loudly, physically, undeniably, that he was wrong the entire time. None of the mysteries covered across this entire conversation would carry any real weight without that foundation sitting underneath them. A void century means nothing if you don't already care about the people it's hurting. An ancient weapon is just a plot device if there's no one standing in its way who actually matters to you. The reason this story has managed to sustain this many interlocking secrets across this many decades isn't just clever plotting. It's that Oda never let the mysteries outweigh the people solving them, which loops all the way back to where this conversation started. A word choice. One Piece. Singular. Whole. Maybe it really is a treasure sitting at the end of the world, waiting to finally answer every question this story has spent decades building. Or maybe, and this is still just a theory worth sitting with, the title was never only about what's waiting at Laugh Tale in the first place. Maybe it was always also about this. A scattered, broken, unlikely group of people, each carrying their own grief, their own buried history, their own reason to have given up on the world a long time ago, somehow becoming, together, exactly what the title's been describing from the very first chapter. One Piece. Whole, because they finally found each other. And that idea keeps stretching forward too, past the current cast entirely, into the next generation quietly being set up in the background of nearly every recent arc. Momonosuke, growing into a leader capable of finally repairing what his father died trying to protect. Shirahoshi, no longer just a frightened princess hiding in a tower, slowly becoming someone capable of carrying an entire kingdom's hopes on her own. Even minor characters, sons and daughters of pirates and revolutionaries scattered across the background of countless islands, hint that whatever ending this story is building toward isn't really the end of anything. It's a handoff. That's been true of every generation this story has shown us so far. Roger's generation gave way to Whitebeard's. Whitebeard's gave way to Luffy's. And somewhere, quietly, in the corners of islands nobody's paying close attention to yet, the next generation after that is already being written into the margins. The same way Luffy himself once was, back before anyone realized a straw hat and a rubber body were hiding a sun god's entire mythology underneath them. Which is maybe the most honest thing that can be said about a story built this carefully, across this many decades, out of this many interlocking secrets. It was never really building toward an ending in the way most stories mean that word. It was building toward a moment, and then, almost certainly, toward everything that comes quietly, hopefully, after it. Doflamingo's fall deserves a closer look too, because on the surface, it plays out like a fairly standard, corrupt warlord gets what's coming to him arc. Except, the mechanics underneath it reveal something important about how power actually functions in this world. Doflamingo didn't just rule Dressrosa through fear, he ruled it through information, blackmail, and decades of quiet manipulation that let him control an entire kingdom's toy industry, its royal family, and its underground weapons trade simultaneously, all while maintaining a public image as a benevolent, beloved king. That's not brute strength winning the day. That's a slow-motion con so patient it took an entire kingdom over a decade to even notice it was happening. His awakened devil fruit ability, turning the whole city's floor into strings capable of puppeting people against their will, works as a disturbingly literal metaphor for exactly what he'd already been doing politically for years. He didn't need supernatural strings to control Dressrosa. He'd already been pulling every string that mattered long before his fruit ever awakened. The awakening just made the metaphor visible. Zoro's arc carries its own quiet through line worth returning to, because his goal has never wavered once across the entire story. Become the world's strongest swordsman, specifically to fulfill a promise made to a childhood rival who died before either of them got the chance to settle their rivalry properly. That's another version of the same pattern running under nearly everyone in this cast. A promise made to someone who's gone, carried forward, refusing to let death be the final word on an unfinished conversation. His duels with Mihawk aren't just about proving strength, they're about closing a loop that's technically already broken, made whole again through sheer stubborn refusal to let a dead friend's dream die with her. And the Marines aren't a monolith either, something the story makes increasingly clear the deeper it goes. The G5 unit, based in the New World, is staffed almost entirely by Marines too reckless, too undisciplined, or too morally uncompromising to function anywhere else in the ranks, which makes them, paradoxically, some of the only Marines in the entire organization willing to bend or ignore orders that cross a line. That's the same tension playing out one more time at yet another scale. Even inside the system built to enforce the government's version of justice, there are always a few people quietly pushing back against it from the inside, the same way Garp did, the same way Sengoku eventually did, the same way this entire story keeps insisting that no system, no matter how carefully built, is ever as unified as it wants the rest of the world to believe. Big Mom's backstory ties several of these threads together in a way that's easy to miss if you only know her as one of the 4 emperors terrorizing Totoland. Charlotte Linlin was raised as a child by a woman named Mother Carmel, who ran an orphanage that took in starving, abandoned children, including Linlin herself, whose monstrous size and appetite had already gotten her rejected by her own biological family. That detail alone reframes her entire adult personality. A woman obsessed with building a family of subjects who'll never leave her, who reacts to abandonment with world-ending rage, was once just a child terrified of being unwanted. Exactly like a lot of characters this story keeps returning to. Here's where it gets darker and stranger. Mother Carmel's orphanage turns out to have a hidden, horrifying purpose, and Linlin's own devil fruit, the Soul fruit, lets her steal pieces of other people's lifespans and turn them into sentient, living creatures called homies. That fruit isn't just a strange power. It's thematically tied directly to her own fear of abandonment, giving her the ability to manufacture companionship out of literal stolen life, rather than ever risking the vulnerability of earning it the way everyone else in this story has to. And Linlin's childhood connects back to Elbaf too, since she spent time among the giants before her own path diverged into piracy, which is part of why her size and strength were always treated as more than a simple genetic anomaly. Even one of the story's most terrifying antagonists turns out to be built from the exact same emotional material as its protagonist. A child nobody wanted, searching for a family, except where Luffy found one through connection, Linlin found one through control. And the entire difference between hero and monster in this story sometimes comes down to exactly that fork in the road. There's one crew this conversation hasn't touched yet, and it might be the single most important piece of history standing between the Void Century and the present day: the Rocks Pirates. Decades before Roger ever became Pirate King, this crew existed as arguably the most terrifying single gathering of raw power the world had ever seen in one place. A young Kaido sailed under its flag. So did a young Big Mom. Even Whitebeard, later the single most feared man on the seas in his own right, was there, fighting under the same banner before everything fell apart. Leading them was a man named Rox D. Zebek, a name that carries the same letter every major D character in this story shares, planted decades before the current cast was even born. At the God Valley incident, this entire crew was finally taken down, not by the government's forces alone, but through a direct alliance between a young Gold D. Roger and a young Monkey D. Garp. Two men who'd go on to become bitter, respectful rivals for the rest of their lives, teaming up exactly once to stop something they both considered too dangerous to let stand. Here's the detail that reframes almost everything about the current era once you sit with it. Kaido and Big Mom, two of the four emperors whose fall we already covered, aren't just powerful pirates who rose up independently. They're survivors of an even more catastrophic generation, one the world was apparently too afraid to let anyone remember clearly. The government scrubbed most records of the Rocks Pirates from public knowledge the same way they scrubbed the Void Century, which means even relatively recent history, within living memory for some of the story's oldest characters, gets the exact same treatment as history from 800 years ago the moment it becomes inconvenient enough. That's the pattern completing itself one more time at the smallest possible scale before the story's ending. It was never just one buried century. It's an ongoing habit, a government that erases whatever threatens its version of order, whether that history is ancient or barely a lifetime old. And Roger, once again, sits at the exact center of the one moment powerful enough to finally start unraveling all of it. Even something as simple as a bounty poster ends up carrying more hidden intention than it first appears to. On the surface, bounty amounts are just a measure of how strong or dangerous a pirate is. Except the story keeps quietly revealing that bounties are really a measure of how threatening the government perceives someone to be, which isn't always the same thing as raw combat strength at all. Luffy's bounty jumps dramatically after incidents that expose government secrets or embarrass the world nobles, sometimes by a far larger margin than after fights that were objectively more physically demanding. Robin's bounty stayed absurdly high for years relative to her fighting ability, specifically because of what she knows, not what she can do in a brawl. That distinction turns bounty posters into a kind of propaganda tool as much as an information network. The government isn't just warning the public about dangerous criminals. It's shaping public perception of who deserves fear and who doesn't, deciding which kinds of threats get broadcast loudly and which ones get quietly downplayed. The exact same selective control over information running through everything from Ohara's destruction to Fisher Tiger's erased legacy. Which makes the formation of the Cross Guild, years after most fans had written Buggy off as permanent comic relief, land as one of the more quietly clever twists in the back half of the story. Buggy, Crocodile, and Mihawk banding together to publicly offer bounties on Navy officers, flipping the entire system's logic back at the government that built it, isn't just a power move. It's 3 former warlords and a clown pirate weaponizing the exact same propaganda machine that's controlled public perception for the entire story, and turning it directly against the people who've always controlled the narrative before now. That's a small, almost gag-driven arc doing exactly what this entire story keeps doing at every scale, from oceans down to individual wanted posters. Taking a system built specifically to keep people controlled, informed only exactly as much as those in power want them to be, and finding some way, however unlikely the source, to turn it back against itself. Skypiea gets treated, by a lot of casual viewers, as one of the more disconnected early arcs. A strange floating island that doesn't obviously tie back into the rest of the world's central mysteries. Except, the deeper the story goes, the more that arc looks like an early plant for some of the biggest reveals still to come. Skypiea's own history involves a civilization called Burka that was forced to flee to the sky centuries earlier, and the ruins scattered across the island hint at technology far more advanced than anything on the Blue Sea. Gold, ancient bells, and a massive tree connecting sky and sea that quietly foreshadows just how old and interconnected this world's forgotten history actually is. Enel, the arc's antagonist, spends the entire story convinced the surface world beneath him is beneath his notice, obsessed instead with a single, specific goal: reaching the moon. At the time, that read mostly as a villain's megalomania, an ambition too absurd to take seriously. Except, once the Lunarians get properly introduced much later, an ancient race with a direct historical connection to the moon itself, Enel's obsession stops looking quite so random. He wasn't chasing a fantasy. He was chasing something the story had already quietly confirmed was real, using knowledge of Skypiea's own buried history that the rest of the world had long since forgotten. That's the kind of long-range plant that's easy to miss on a first watch and nearly impossible to miss on a second one. An arc that felt, for years, like a fun but slightly disconnected detour turns out to be one of the earliest, clearest hints that this world's mysteries reach even further than the ocean itself, stretching from the deepest trenches where ancient robots and ancient weapons sleep, all the way up past the clouds, toward a moon this story has been quietly building toward for longer than most fans ever gave it credit for. Whitebeard's death at Marineford deserves one more look, because it's easy to remember that scene purely for Ace's loss and forget how much weight Whitebeard himself was quietly carrying into it. Unlike Big Mom, who built her idea of family out of stolen lifespans and controlled loyalty, Whitebeard built his crew out of genuine, freely given devotion. Men and women who followed him, not out of fear, but because he was, by all accounts, the first person in their lives to actually treat them like they mattered. That's the same fork in the road Big Mom's backstory ran into, except Whitebeard chose the other path entirely, decades earlier, and built one of the most powerful crews in the world on top of that choice. His final words at Marineford, confirming the existence of the One Piece to the entire world in his dying moments, weren't a slip or a moment of weakness. They were a direct continuation of the exact same move Roger made at his own execution decades earlier. Information given away freely at the cost of his own life, specifically to make sure the next generation had something worth chasing. Two of the most powerful men the world had ever produced, on opposite sides of piracy's history, independently deciding the most valuable thing they could leave behind wasn't gold, or territory, or even victory. It was a reason for someone else to keep going. That's the thread this entire mountain of mysteries keeps returning to, no matter which corner of the story you're standing in. The Void Century, the ancient weapons, the Lunarians, the D-Clan, all of it eventually funnels back down to the same handful of people, across generations, choosing to hand something forward instead of hoarding it, trusting the next person in line to actually be worth the risk. Even the crew's first ship carries more weight than a simple mode of transportation, and it's worth pausing on before wrapping everything up. The Going Merry isn't treated structurally like a vehicle. It's treated like a member of the crew in its own right, present for nearly every major early triumph and tragedy, patched back together again and again, long past the point any reasonable shipwright would call it seaworthy, purely because the crew refused to let it go. When it finally can't be repaired anymore, the story doesn't just have it sink quietly in the background. It gives the ship an actual funeral, complete with a moment where the Mary, somehow, impossibly, seems to steer itself out to sea one last time under its own power, as if it understood exactly what was happening and chose to make the ending easier on the people who loved it. That's not a small emotional beat buried in an early arc. It's the story establishing, this early, that even objects in this world can carry the same weight as characters, if enough genuine care gets poured into them over time. That idea echoes forward into the Thousand Sunny, the ship that replaces it, built specifically to carry the crew the rest of the way. A literal, physical symbol of moving forward without ever fully leaving what came before behind. The old ship's figurehead gets preserved. Its memory gets folded into the new one. Nothing this story loves ever really disappears completely. It just gets carried forward, piece by piece, the same way everything else covered across this entire conversation eventually does. There's one last ability worth mentioning before wrapping everything up, because it might be the single clearest thread tying Luffy directly to Joy Boy without needing a single line of exposition to prove it. It's called the Voice of All Things, an almost mythical form of hearing that lets certain rare individuals communicate with animals, plants, and even inanimate parts of the world most people can't perceive as alive at all. It's treated, across the story, as something so rare that entire lifetimes pass without anyone achieving it. Zunisha has it, which is part of how the Elephant Island communicates with the handful of people who've earned its trust across 1,000 years of walking. And near the climax of the Wano arc, Luffy briefly, unexpectedly, hears it too. A moment the story doesn't over-explain, doesn't dwell on for pages, just lets happen and moves past almost as quickly as it arrived. Except that kind of restraint, by this point, should feel familiar. This is a story that plants details decades before they matter, that hides gods inside comedy fruits, that buries entire kingdoms of history under one erased century. A single quiet moment where its protagonist briefly hears what only a handful of legendary figures have ever heard isn't a throwaway detail. It's confirmation, delivered as gently as possible, that everything this conversation has covered, the Void Century, the Ancient Kingdom, Joy Boy's unfinished promise, Zunisha's 1,000-year walk, was never really separate threads at all. They were always the same story, quietly converging on the same person the whole time. One relationship this conversation hasn't properly closed the loop on is Vivi, and her story might be the clearest counterpoint to everything said so far about freedom being this story's central value. She sailed with the Straw Hats through one of their most formative arcs, fought alongside them, earned a place on that crew in every way that matters emotionally. And when the moment came to formally join them, flag and all, she chose not to. She stayed behind, in Alabasta, to rebuild her kingdom and take up the responsibility of ruling it after her father's death. At first glance, that reads like the story quietly punishing her for choosing duty over adventure, a bittersweet goodbye and nothing more. Except the way the crew treats that decision says something different. Nobody guilts her for it. Nobody frames her choice as smaller or lesser than theirs. The story simply accepts that freedom doesn't have to mean the same thing for every single person in it. For Luffy, freedom means the open sea. For Vivi, freedom meant the ability to choose her own responsibility, rather than having a crown and a kingdom's expectations forced onto her without any say in the matter at all. That's a quieter, more grounded version of the exact same theme running through everything covered across this entire conversation. From Nika's mythology down to Luffy's own simple, stubborn refusal to be anything other than exactly who he is. Freedom, in this story, was never really about running away from responsibility. It was always about getting to choose it for yourself. Fujitora might be the clearest proof yet that not everyone wearing a marine coat actually believes in the system they're enforcing. Blind by choice, having sacrificed his own sight rather than use it in a way he considered dishonorable, he's openly stated on the page that he thinks the warlord system was a mistake, that he distrusts the government's reliance on fear and secrecy, and that he'd rather see the whole rotten structure at the top scaled back than keep propping it up out of blind loyalty. That's an extraordinary thing for an admiral, one of the most powerful enforcers of the exact system this entire conversation has spent hours picking apart, to say out loud in front of his own superiors without immediately being removed from his post. Which means, even at the very top of the Marines, sitting just below the fleet admiral himself, there are people who see the same cracks in this world that Robin saw, that Cobra saw, that Dragon built an entire army around. The difference is that Fujitora hasn't chosen rebellion. He's chosen to keep working from inside a system he doesn't fully believe in, betting, quietly, that change is more achievable from within than from outside it entirely. That's the same argument the story's been circling for its entire runtime, playing out one more time in one more character right up near the very top of the world's power structure. Reform or revolution? Work within a broken system or tear it down and build something new? This story has never fully answered which approach is correct because it doesn't seem interested in a single, tidy answer. It seems far more interested in showing every possible person, from a blind admiral to a rubber pirate captain, to a rebel leader who happens to be that captain's own father, choosing their own answer in their own way, and trusting the reader to sit with all of them at once. Katakuri deserves a mention too, if only because he might be the clearest example in the entire series of a villain whose power and vulnerability come from the exact same place. As one of Big Mom's most feared sons, he's built a public reputation as calm, composed, and nearly unbeatable, partly through genuine skill, and partly through decades of carefully managing exactly how the rest of the world perceives him. His devil fruit ability, combined with an unusually advanced form of observation haki, lets him glimpse brief flashes of the immediate future, reacting to attacks before they even fully happen, which made him, for most of his life, effectively untouchable in a fight. Except that same advanced perception ability requires him to keep his mouth, permanently disfigured since childhood by his own devil fruit-related condition, hidden at all times, since revealing it breaks the intense focus his ability depends on. For years, he's maintained an image of effortless perfection, specifically to hide something he was taught, by the people closest to him, to be deeply ashamed of. When Luffy finally does see it, mid-fight, Katakuri doesn't react with rage or humiliation the way you'd expect from someone that guarded. He reacts with something closer to relief, as if part of him had been waiting a long time for someone strong enough to see the real him and not immediately look away. That's one more version of a pattern this entire conversation keeps returning to from every possible direction. The strongest, most intimidating characters in this story are almost never simply strong. They're strong and hiding something. Strong and still carrying a wound most people never get close enough to see, which might be the real reason this cast, villains included, has managed to stay this compelling across a story running this long. One last, fairly recent development is worth mentioning, because it fits so neatly into everything covered about the government's response to a changing world. After Wano's fall and the shakeup among the four emperors, Marine headquarters relocates to Marijois itself, physically moving the entire military command structure directly into the same sacred, restricted city where the Celestial Dragons and the Five Elders already reside. For most of the story, there was at least a small physical and symbolic distance between the Marines' public role enforcing justice and the government's private, more openly corrupt inner sanctum. That distance disappears entirely with this move. It's not framed as a subtle detail either. It's the story visually confirming that whatever pretense of separation used to exist between the Marines protecting the world and the government controlling it is gone, consolidated into a single, unified stronghold as the world enters a more dangerous, less stable era. Every thread covered across this conversation, the hidden elders, the erased history, the ancient weapons, the quiet cracks of dissent from officers like Fujitora and Garp, all of it now sits, quite literally, under one roof. That kind of consolidation rarely happens by accident in a story planned this carefully. It reads like preparation, a government bracing itself for exactly the kind of confrontation everything covered here has been building toward for decades. Which means whatever comes next, wherever this entire mountain of mysteries finally lands, it's very likely going to happen with every major piece of the world's power, secrets included, gathered in the same place at the same time for the first time in the story's history. It's worth naming the Kingdom Im erased, because leaving it vague undersells just how real that threat actually is inside the story's own current timeline. Lulusia is shown on the page being wiped out entirely, its people, its land, its entire existence erased in what the story frames as a single, deliberate act carried out from that hidden throne room, not as ancient history, not as a rumor passed down for centuries, but as something happening in the present, while the main cast is still very much alive and moving through the world it happened in. That's the detail that finally makes every earlier warning about Im feel less like foreshadowing and more like an active countdown. This isn't a threat locked safely in the past, the way the Void Century's worst atrocities technically are. This is a demonstrated, current-era capability, used casually enough that most of the world barely seems to register it as unusual. Which means whatever confrontation this entire story has been building toward for decades isn't just about uncovering old secrets anymore. It's about stopping something that's still actively, currently capable of doing exactly what it's always done, right up until the very last page. So think back for a second to everything this world has been quietly hiding underneath its surface. A word choice in a title that turned out to describe far more than a treasure. A dying man's laugh that named an entire island. A hat handed to a child, carried across an ocean for over 1,000 chapters, still intact. A century of history so dangerous that kings were killed and islands were burned just to keep it buried. And a handful of people, generation after generation, who kept trying to dig it back up anyway, no matter what it cost them. None of it was ever separate. That's really the whole point once you step back far enough to see the shape of it. The Void Century isn't just old lore sitting in the background. It's the reason Robin grew up believing she didn't deserve to exist. It's the reason Wano stayed sealed off from the world for decades. It's the reason a king died mid-sentence trying to tell the truth to people who should have already known it. Every mystery this story has ever asked you to care about eventually traces back to the same buried room, the same erased century. The same handful of people at the very top who decided a long time ago that the world was safer without the whole truth in it. And against all of that, stacked up over 800 years of careful, deliberate control, this story keeps putting its faith in the simplest possible answer. Not a weapon, not a scheme, not a clever plan to outmaneuver a government that's had centuries to prepare for exactly this kind of threat. Just a boy who refuses to stop laughing, refuses to stop trusting people, refuses, even now, to let the size of what he's up against change who he actually is underneath it. That's why the small details end up mattering as much as the big ones. Why a flag with a straw hat drawn onto a skull carries as much weight as an ancient weapon. Why a single sentence, whispered to a grieving child by a dying giant, echoes for 20 years until it finally gets proven true. Why a promise made between three boys on top of a hill outlives fire, war, and death itself, and still finds a way to keep mattering, one brother at a time, until there's nothing left to hide it. This story has spent decades teaching its audience the same lesson its own government has spent centuries trying to erase: that history doesn't stay buried, that promises don't expire just because the person who made them is gone, that the truth, no matter how carefully it's hidden, tends to find its way back to the surface eventually, usually carried by exactly the kind of person nobody in power ever thought to take seriously. Somewhere out there, past the red line, past the calm belts, at the very edge of a map that took a century to erase and decades more to piece back together, there's an island where a laughing pirate once stood and saw the truth for himself. Whatever's actually waiting there, whatever one piece really turns out to mean once the last page is finally drawn, one thing about this story has never really been in question. It was never just about the treasure. It never really was. It was about everyone who kept walking toward it anyway.